Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش الجندي العربي،
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزارع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه. فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروح حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروح حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرنا. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرنا. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح. عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح. عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى
عدينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Не стоит снегопад, не летит верный богат.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. We are in the evening of the 27th of February, 2024, and it is the correct time for starting. It is almost 10:30 exactly, British time. And we are here tonight to discuss the latest iteration in a long-running campaign that I am going to call the Islamic Panic, which is, of course, a deliberate campaign waged by the British ruling class to stoke up as many divisions in the working class as possible. And they have various different motivations to do this, some short-term, some long-term. And we're going to be exploring how this sits as part of a long-term strategy of the British ruling class that, in its modern iteration, goes back at least 30 years. And I'm in a almost, if not unique position to look at this, but I am in a position to look at this where I can draw upon some of my own academic history, given that I had a very, what you might call a vehement falling out with one of my master's level university lecturers when I insisted on applying a materialist analysis to British multicultural institutions, upon which he dismissed me as a third international Marxist, which I have carried with me as a compliment ever since. So before we get into things, I will do the customary greetings. We've got a question here coming in from Paul Morland, and this was sent in 2 hours ago, who says, "Greetings, Alex. When I was a teenager, I used to listen to Radio Tirana and heard readings from Enver Hoxha's Reflections on China, denouncing Mao. I'd love to hear your views on this split. Appreciate you are currently engaged elsewhere in the Balkans. Tito certainly got the Hoxha treatment too." Well, I would say on the China-Albania split, as on all of Hoxha's splits, with the Soviet Union, then with, first with Yugoslavia, then with the Soviet Union, then with China, all of them were tragic and very damaging. Now, of the various things that Hoxha said about Mao and China, a lot of them, if you read his later critiques, so for instance in the later 1970s, where he's talking about capitalist restoration, some of what he says is accurate when he's denouncing Deng Xiaoping and the Hua Guofeng leadership. But on the other hand, like a lot of what he says, he just goes straight over into, like, again, like ultra-leftism. It mirrors his errors on the split with the USSR and on his analysis of the Khrushchevite revisionists. He makes a lot of points, does Hoxha, against the Khrushchevite revisionists that are wholly correct, such as their abandonment of key aspects of Leninism, their opportunism, their pursuit of their pursuit of the continuing legitimacy of the party in the eyes of the working class, not through a consistent struggle to retain the party's position within the working class, but by taking opportunistic methods, basically taking the path that Khrushchev did, which is just seeking to increase the provision of consumer goods as a means of buying further legitimacy with the working class, rather than engaging in a consistent struggle for the party's position within the working class via political means, and also the consistent struggle against bourgeois tendencies, all of which was, of course, given up. So when you get the combination of moving from a question of the party's legitimacy as the leader of the working class in a consistent struggle for socialism to be merely the party as a provider of material benefits to the working class, then that's a different relationship, and ultimately that secures the social democratic degeneration into revisionism and liquidationism in the Soviet party. So when he was making those points, he was correct. And then he spins off into making wild and over-the-top points about China, as he did with the USSR. He starts calling China an imperialist power, a power that's going to collapse into forms of fascism, starts flinging around allegations of social fascism, all of which are wildly ultra-left and over the top. It's the same with all of his critiques. his critiques of Tito, for instance. Again, like read his very long work, The Titoites, where, to be honest, he doesn't come out of it looking particularly good either, given that he was prepared to back the Kosovan Albanian terroristic campaigns that were backed by the imperialists. Again, as all ultra-lefts, he ends up spinning off to the right. So also it damaged Albania severely by engaging in this very public split with the Chinese. I mean, he would have done much better to look at things the way that Kim Il-sung did, which was that Kim Il-sung and the Koreans didn't choose a side in the Sino-Soviet split. They had their critiques of the people's democracies in Eastern Europe. They had their critiques of the Soviet Union. However, they kept open relations with both, but never remained a hostage of either. Now, what the Koreans did was that they never allowed themselves to be dependent upon anybody. I think with their history of being dominated by the Japanese colonialists and the brutal treatment they received from them, put within the Korean Revolution a strong sense of independence, as it did in the Albanians as well. But I think that the Koreans always insisted that they wanted to develop their own industrial base, their own industries. They didn't want to be reliant upon the Soviet Union or the Chinese, not out of hostility, but because they knew that they had to rely on their own resources. And it was the fact that they did rely on their own resources and they had such a strong relationship and between the party and the masses and the state, in the sense that the masses really do rule in people's career, that they were able to survive the late 80s and in the challenges of the 90s. I make this point because I think the validity of Kim Il-sung's approach versus Hoxha's approach is borne out by the fact that they were able to do all the things that Hoxha wanted, which was to remain independent, but didn't renounce all their ties with the gigantic socialist states, and didn't engage in like long and ultimately pointless polemics that Hoxha did. Some Hoxhaists would say, well, he's a great man of principle, but there's a point where the great man of principle needs to give way to a certain amount of realism, which is you can convey perhaps what you think to the leaders of the Chinese and the Soviet parties in proper channels, but ultimately these weren't social imperialist or social fascist powers like all the things that Hoxha said. And by going down that road, he only isolated Albania without bringing anything positive in return. Now, ultimately, Albania was weakened by that. Now, I'm not saying that had they retained their relationship with China that they could have survived the 1980s. Perhaps nothing could have done that, but I certainly think that the split didn't help. Nor did the split with Yugoslavia help either. It didn't help either of them. Hoxha used to accuse Tito of having a plan to install himself as like God Emperor of the Balkans, which was, of course, based on Tito floating the idea of this greater Balkan Federation, which would include Albania, and I think he wanted it, if there was a successful revolution in Greece, to include Greece as well. And of course, that immediately put Hoxha and the Albanian party's backs up. Again, like a very fiercely independent people, quite rightly so. But again, like the split for which Tito deserves most of the blame, the split in the common form and the split with the Albanians. But again, in the end, it didn't do either of them any good. The splits in the socialist camp just damaged everybody and enabled imperialism to work angles on all of them. Because even though they were prepared to laud Tito in the late 40s and early 50s, they never stopped working secretly for the undermining of Tito's, the Titoite government there, and never stopped looking for ways to bring it down. So, again, all that this got us, really, the Sino-Soviet split, the Albanian splits, everything else was, in the end, a lot of bad ultra-leftist analysis of what the Soviet Union was, of what China was and is, and ultimately the weakening of global socialism, for which all of them carry a responsibility, principally Tito, Khrushchev, and others. But I mean, Hoxha too. I mean, look at his analysis of Mao and Mao's contributions to the Marxist-Leninist canon, shall we say. It's complete drivel, by the way. And so is the work of, on this particular question, of other Marxists like Bill Bland, which is the claim that capitalism had been completely restored in the Soviet Union by the 60s, which was completely a completely undialectical analysis, that Mao had never been a Marxist, that he was actually a representative of the Chinese comprador bourgeoisie, that he was diluting Marxism with Chinese mysticism. Again, like for all that Mao, the great revolutionary that he was, certainly made mistakes. Hoxha's treatment of him later on was just ultra left crap, I'm sorry to say. And that doesn't diminish Hoxha as a great revolutionary leader in his own right, but my God, you read some of his later stuff, it's not positive at all. It does. You won't learn anything from actually reading it. All you get is like it's essentially just an ultra left binge of the kind that Lenin justly criticized in Left Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Jay, good evening to you. Raziel, good evening to you. Yes, we will be getting to Lee Anderson, clown that he is. Evening to Albert and morning to Banana Bender and President Jesus out there in the land of the perpetual Gavin Newsom dictatorship. Tusker, hello to you. Good evening to Slava out there in Chicago, or should I say, good late afternoon. Jawad, who says salam, and Lee, good evening to you. Austin, from the mostly beautiful state of Idaho, USA. Never been there, hope to go there someday. Clavet, good evening to you. Ian Foster, good evening, comrade. Luca says, good evening, pausing the reading of Capital to hear what the ruling class is up to. Well, it's nothing good. Hello to Kent out there in Minneapolis. Michael Hodgson joining us from Ontario, Canada. And Zim Left Radio joins us from Bristol. Otis, who says good evening, and I say good evening back. Matthew, good evening to you. And Red Star Betty joining us from Durham in the People's Democratic Republic of, is it Northumberland? And CJ joins us, who says sewing letters and enjoying the return of the old playlist. Yes, I brought back the classics. Red Star Betty is enjoying Lenin is Young again. C Bolt, good evening to you. And we've got Human NR 1979, Martin from Vienna. Hello to you. Ash says, good morning from the arse end of the world. Rather unflattering way to describe Melbourne. Luca says, any thoughts on the summit in Paris yesterday? Are the EU leaders starting to panic? Well, they should be. They should be starting to panic because it's all going hideously wrong for them in particular. And they, with regard to Ukraine specifically, look, you look at even the Institute for the Study of War is concluding that the war is flowing in the direction of the Russians. And the question is then, well, what are they going to do? Now you've got Macron, like again doing his usual thing of going wildly back between two different positions. On the one hand, he'll say, well, we can't have a war in Europe, and on the other hand, he'll say, well, maybe we need to deploy troops to Ukraine. Of course, he can't do that. The way in which they're sort of going wildly between different viewpoints is, I think, partly the hysteria Macron is trying to whip up is perhaps partly based around trying to overcome potential opposition to further weapons and money packages from potentially Fico and Orban, potentially. It's also about them trying desperately to find some sort of common position. Because at the moment they don't have one. They get the feeling that the US is basically slowly backing away from this, which they are, in truth. They are looking, of course, one of the reasons why the US is in this situation where the Speaker of the House of Representatives, I'm going to give him Medvedev's name for him, Michael Jackson, is vehemently opposing further financial aid to Ukraine is because a section of the US ruling class has worked out that this is a loser now, and they don't want to be seen to be throwing good money after bad. Some of them have decided that Biden's finished, and so best to cut this thing off, hang the whole thing round his neck, and then focus on the trouble they want to make for the Chinese. So the EU will then be left up a certain creek without a certain paddle. So having ruined their relations with the Russians, they will then be left holding the bag when it comes to Ukraine, which they won't be able to handle. There is also a couple of other things in the mix as well. There's this New York Times story on the fact, telling us what we all knew, that the CIA and other intelligence agencies, mainly MI6, and I think the French as well, have been using Ukraine as a base of operations against Russia for over a decade. Actually, it's more like 30 years. And why admit to this now? Why admit that Budanov is a CIA asset, which they essentially did? So there's a lot of theories floating around there about why that was put together and why the New York Times ran it. Could be that they're trying to shift the narrative in favor of a distant war, should we say, a war that will be run as an insurgency, the original war that the Americans thought they were going to get when they thought that the Russians were going to knock Ukraine over in 24 hours and then they'd move over onto some sort of long-term insurgency. Turns out the Russian approach was far more Clausewitzian, shall we say, in its approach to destroying Ukraine's fighting capacity. So the EU leaders have finally woken up and are reading the runes here, or the chicken's innards, if you want to be a soothsayer like Marianne Williamson about this, and are realizing that the Americans are on the way out. That's why J.D. Vance turned up, I think, at the Munich Security Conference and basically said, yeah, this isn't working, this is over. So they know it's finished. It's just a matter of time. The only concern I think that the Americans will really have is trying to ensure that this implosion doesn't land too badly. I mean, Americans in the chat can chip in as to how badly this is going to go across. Certainly, I think that certain elements, even within the bigger bourgeois of the United States, have come to a decision that Biden is cooked, and if they have to tolerate 4 years of Trump, they'll tolerate 4 years of Trump. They can. I mean, he's all on board for the China shit. He's all on board with regime change operations in South America and the Caribbean, which is a big concern of the big U.S. imperialists, the biggest capitalists. And so therefore, like, sealing off this Ukraine business and, letting Trump sign on the line with the Russians, I think some in the U.S. ruling class have come to the conclusion that, well, that might be better than throwing good money after bad. We can continue to fund the insurgency war there, but this big level commitment, well, we need to move that elsewhere. And that seems to be, in my mind, that's the way things are going. I mean, I've said for a while now that I think the ultimate end point of this is the establishment of what I'm going to call continuity Ukraine around the historic western parts of Ukraine that were formerly part of Poland and what was once Austria-Hungary, and the capital of it being in Lvov. And that will be something that will be probably set up to great fanfare by the Americans, then abandoned by the Americans, and the EU leaders will be told, now it's your job to prop it up. So I think that's why they're panicking. They're going to be left holding this thing. The Banderite Western Ukraine will be their project to manage, and they'll be told that they've got to put it in NATO and they've got to put it in the EU, because that will then be presented as a victory. I anticipate like a gigantic blown up map of Western Ukraine will then be put on CNN, and it will be presented as, this is what Ukraine's always been. That other part of Ukraine, that whole Kyiv thing, remember that? No? Good. That didn't happen. The capital's always been Lvov. It's always been this big. We've put it in NATO. We've put it in the EU. Russia has stopped attacking. We've won. Now, if you don't believe that they would do that, then I would ask you to review the things that they are currently asking you to believe. So this is the panic. They, unlike the Americans, they have to live next door to the Russians. They are going to be left holding this unstable, deeply corrupt statelet on the edge of Europe, with a gigantic, expanded Russian, not just military, but expanded Russian industry. Essentially, the Russians are going through a massive industrial expansion at the moment, so that they are going to be, even though they're not formally in the EU, of course, then one won't be, but they are certainly the biggest economy in Europe, and they're going to be, the war is going to leave Russia as a far more powerful state than it was beforehand. And the Americans are going to leave the EU face down in the mud on that one. They're also worried that at a certain point, some of in the American ruling class who are perhaps a little bit more, if not ambitious, then they are a little bit more attuned to their long-term interests, might start to think that, well, where's Europe going to go? We don't really need to keep all these military assets there. We can just pull them out bit by bit, and we can focus on what we really need to be doing, which is securing control over what they regard as their hemisphere. So like all of the Americas, all of the Caribbean, and also adding to what they call their competition, i.e. their operations against China in Asia, in the Asia Pacific region. And they can think to themselves, well, we'll keep Europe on a leash, but we don't really need to have all these forces there anymore. And also they're worried that NATO might fall apart. If Trump gets in and is allowed to do a few things, if the U.S. ruling class writes, and if not writes off Europe, then downgrades its importance, then what is the significance of NATO being weakened or going away or imploding? The significance is that NATO, as I've said before, was never really about preventing a Soviet invasion. Not really. It was a Soviet invasion or invasion by the Warsaw Pact was never on the cards. The Soviet leadership under Stalin or under the revisionists, had no plans for that whatsoever. I mean, yes, plans existed to fight a war, but this would have been a defensive war against an aggressive NATO bloc. So what was it really all about? The establishment of NATO was principally about keeping the US keeping itself in Western Europe in a way to secure the still shaky-looking re-established capitalist regimes in 1949. Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, etc. And ever since then, NATO has been about keeping US control and keeping control over these countries. And if and securing them in place, securing the ruling classes in place, both making sure that they remain there, using the NATO structures to undermine and physically assail via gladio means sometimes, communist and trade unionist movements, but also making sure that the ruling classes in Europe remained solidly behind the US bloc. If the US ruling class decides that Europe's done and they've got what they need out of it and it's time to move on, then a big element of security for the European ruling classes goes. And that will leave them in a much more vulnerable position, not really about facing off against the Russians, who have no serious plans to invade Europe. In fact, they have even less of a capability of doing that than the Soviet Union ever did. But their main concern will be the disintegration of their alliances and the fact that this will leave them less secure in the face of their own enraged working classes. So it's a fear that ultimately is rooted in the destruction of the entire post-World War II order. And the post-World War II order, which has re-established capitalism in all of these countries, and again after the counter-revolutions of 1989 in the East, which was done in a way that was designed to crush socialism and crush the working class. Capitalism was reimposed in the West by military force and concessions at the same time. It's a combination of concessions and repressions that were carried out to restore capitalism in the destroyed countries of Europe after World War II. And you can't escape that origin. So when their fear has always been, if the US decides that to cut Europe off and focus its energies elsewhere in preserving itself elsewhere, then there will be a reckoning ultimately with their own working classes, and that the power of the US, both economically and militarily, if it diminishes to the point where they can't defend the European ruling classes anymore, they're terrified that they won't be able to do it themselves, and this will mean the end for them. Now, that's a rather elongated way of answering your question, Luca. I hope you found it useful. J. Coprario says, good evening all and greetings from Oxford. R.I.P. Aaron Bushnell. Yes, I should really offer a comment about that. I found his death to be, of course, a rather depressing incident. Many people are, of course, saying, oh, rest in power and all that, but I agree with a comment made by Comrade Marius on the Telegram chat, where he said that, and rightly so, that his death really is a condemnation in some ways, not just of the US ruling class, of course it is, but of the various protest movements inside the United States and in Britain, to be fair. But this is an American question, so we'll focus on America. The protests in the United States, similar to my own country, have of course been large. They've been noisy. They've made a bit of an impact. They've certainly kicked Biden around to the point where I think, as I said, certain elements of the ruling class are writing Biden off now. But of course, it can't stop the slaughter in Gaza, and it hasn't found a way so far to stop the provision of weaponry to the Israeli regime, and thus the murder spree that the Netanyahu gang is engaged in Gaza. And from Aaron Bushnell's statements on the matter before his death by self-immolation, we can see that this distressed him a great deal, as it should any thinking and feeling person. And I agree with what Marius was saying and others have said, which is that if only such a man who had awakened from the propaganda sleep that everybody is put in the West, especially as a serving member of the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Armed Forces, who has woken up to the horrors that the U.S. is committing in the world, that the only way he saw to make an impact was to commit suicide, is a tremendously depressing thing. And it is a condemnation of the U.S. left, as well as, of course, the ruling class, who his suicidal protest was targeted at. But it condemns the U.S. left as well, because it engages in these safe, dead-end protests, which the ruling class shrugs off largely. Yes, Biden is finished, but they can tolerate 4 years of Trump. The libs will go mad, and the various different sort of talking heads will explode. But some in the ruling class have clearly decided that they can tolerate Trump for 4 years. They can kick the Democratic Party and the Republican Party back into shape, and then they can bring in another guy in 4 years. And besides, Trump doesn't truly control the federal government anyway. Now, they may be wrong in their calculations, but clearly that's the calculations that some of them are making. So yes, it may finish Biden off, but it hasn't gone after hasn't escalated to the level where the US has to seriously recalculate. And there's been no national movement that has emerged that could take men like Aaron Bushnell, men who were waking up to the realities of the system that they were serving, and take them in a more positive direction. Only really a national communist party in the United States of a meaningful size and with meaningful roots in the working class could start to do that. Now, I know that many comrades in the United States are working towards that, and we're certainly working towards it in our own country. But I find the whole incident to be terrifically sad. He is being applauded, but I think it's a waste of a life that could have been spent much better serving the U.S. revolution, to be honest. And it's not something that I'm not going to engage in the sort of the morbid celebrations that some are engaging in. Of course, the Zionists and the imperialists are screaming that he was a lunatic and various other slanders upon his name. But I just find it very sad that this man couldn't find another way to engage in a revolutionary struggle. This kind of self-immolation, whilst it's dramatic and whilst it is going to affect certain people, I find that it's, again, suicide in protest at something. Can be iconic in many ways if it's captured in media. But I think next to a lifetime of dedication to a revolutionary struggle, it fades away quite quickly. And that's, again, very unfortunate and very sad. Right, Tristan in Maryland, good evening to you. Thomas, hello to you. So where are we? Hello to Jenny. Red Star Betty says, Durham is the main city of County Durham, but it was once part of the ancient kingdom of Northumbria, so we could bring back those pre-Norman borders again. Start a People's Democratic Republic in Northumbria and reclaim the pre-Norman borders. Throw off the Norman yoke, comrade. As an American, I can say, hang on, folks, it's about to get worse, says Cobra Commander. Wayne Tables says, Biden will not be the candidate. If he is, then the DNC he's trying to lose on purpose. Or they are indifferent. They make more money opposing Trump. They don't want actual accountability. Well, that's very true. The DNC is, after all, a business. They started building chip and semiconductor plants here in Arizona. Yeah, they scalped the Taiwanese. Thomas says they're giving Ukrainians asylum in the West, for now, yet Haitians, Latin Americans and Arabs are denied it. Well, I wouldn't say that the Ukrainians are going to be greeted forever. Once they've decided that the Ukraine show is over, that drawbridge gets pulled up. Ian Foster says the EU is beginning to implode. The total failure of Ukraine sanctions and war is bringing forward its ultimate collapse. How long can it continue? No more than a decade, Ian, I don't think. Good evening to Martin, who's joined us. Wayne says, opposing Trump gives the Democratic Party purpose. Without Trump, they'd actually need to believe in something or do something. Without Trump, they are doing a genocide and hemorrhaging support. Well, they're doing a genocide and hemorrhaging support even with Trump. And they do believe in things. They are a elite party that is operated on an oligarchic basis. They are a party that is designed to defend the class interests of the US ruling class. Now, of course, they're not going to say that publicly. They're going to play their usual games on what they present themselves as. But yes, I mean, without Trump, well, what do they have? Nothing. They've got nothing even with Trump, though. Just saying, but Trump doesn't work anymore. President Jesus says, PBS had a segment on the 2-year anniversary of the war where a guest from the Hudson Institute stressed the need for direct strikes into Russia to inflict pain, basically called for terrorism. Yeah, that's the way they're going. And they've already done that. They've already been doing terrorism in Russia. I mean, the whole thing regarding the New York Times story and the admission that they've been using Ukraine as a base of operations against Russia. Yeah, they've been launching terrorism strikes in Russia, not just from Ukraine, but from Chechnya for 30 years. Going back, if we go back all the way to the beginning of the Chechen War, so it's at least in the origins of which the CIA and MI6 had a role. So they've been doing this game for a long time. The Russians know it too. If they think they're going to wage some successful insurgency in central and eastern Ukraine when it's taken over completely by the Russians, I think they've got another thing coming. HM says, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall episode has disappeared from YouTube. Will it be uploaded to Patreon? No. I've deleted that episode, and I've deleted it for the specific reasons that that I wasn't happy with the way I presented the subject, to be blunt. I thought that my presentation of it and my explanation of it wasn't good enough. So I will be redoing that episode from scratch to answer your question. And I will do that when I feel that I haven't done a good enough job explaining something, or I have messed something up. I will get rid of it and I will redo it. So Matthew says, American working class don't care about Ukraine or Palestinian or whatever. They worry about daily living issues. Then the US turns towards the South Hemisphere. That might energize protest. Well, I think if you're in the United States, you will know this better than me. I think there's a certain segment of the US working class that clearly is animated by Palestine, not in an effective direction. But I would say that about Ukraine, there's been nothing on that whatsoever. I think there's been nothing here either. The ruling class, and we'll come to the Islamic Panic question in a minute. The ruling class tried to get an anti-Russia panic going on. It just didn't work. It just didn't work at all because there's no resonance here at all. I mean, amongst the working class, there was none. Amongst the petty bourgeois, like generally speaking, the wealthier the person, the more likely they were to engage in like anti-Russia shit. But it just doesn't work. I mean, that's why they've brought out the Islamic Panic stuff again. That has a bit more resonance, and we'll come to why in a moment. Ash says, suicide has always been an act of hopelessness. It should never be celebrated or turned into martyrdom, and Ash is completely correct. Mr. Chopin says, greetings from Kansas, and greetings right back to you. Lurtis says, most ruthless self-criticism. Also, evening. Well, if you can't criticize, your own practices should always be the subject of the most ruthless criticism, as we said the other day. Wayne says, or asks, how do you respond to the general critique of the USSR that they forced other countries of the Eastern Bloc to be socialist? I'd say that that's completely wrong. I would say that if you look at the developments between the 1944 and 1948, when the people's democracies in the East were set up, look at how they were actually formed. In places like Poland, for instance, there was a strong underground anti-Nazi guerrilla movement, which had multiple different streams within it. There was a more bourgeois element that was linked to the exiled Polish government in London. But there was very strong proletarian and peasant elements in there that were responding to the sheer naked brutality of the Nazis. And all of them, after 1944 and the liberation of Poland, were strongly in favor of socialist transformation. Even like the Polish Peasant Party, which was headed by some pretty reactionary figures, declared itself in favor of confiscation of the large estates and nationalization of the largest industries. So same in Bulgaria, same in Romania, same in Hungary. All of these places actually underwent a socialist transformation powered by the elite elements of the working class and the peasantry after World War II. Now, what happened was, because the Red Army was there, they didn't intervene to create these revolutions. They just didn't restore the capitalist order by force, which is what the US and the British and the French did in the West. So if you examine what happened in the formation of, say, socialist Poland, let's take the country that the West always loves to cite. That was, first of all, that was never a one-party state. The PUWP was formerly in a bloc with a couple of other parties. What happened was that the USSR tried over and over and over again to reach some kind of accommodation with the imperialists. It was the imperialists who put up the Iron Curtain. Then they accused the USSR of doing it. But in terms of the socialist transformation in those countries, in the 4 years that sort of ran until the foundations of NATO being set up, that socialist transformation was powered by the proletariat and peasantries in those countries. And if you look at a place like Yugoslavia or Albania, well, those were revolutions in their own right. So again, this is a classic case of projection. It was in the West, France and Italy in particular, and West Germany, the masses there all wanted to move towards socialism. So what happened in the West was, of course, that certain concessions were made, but then NATO is formed and the Western Bloc is militarized to do what? To secure against Soviet invasion? No. To secure against socialist transformation inside those countries. That's why NATO was really organized, or one of the big reasons anyway. So I would say that the way that the imperialists present the foundation of the people's democracies is completely backwards. It was a revolutionary process in all of those countries. The Red Army was just there essentially as a liberating force, and the Red Army just didn't intervene to stop the process of taking over the land of the estates of the big landowners, and in nationalizing industry. So again, like, it's a case of projection from the imperialists. They re-established capitalism by force in Western Europe, and also by the rigging of elections. Beju, good evening to you, comrade. Tony asks, did you glad to see you when you were live? Do you think that Hezbollah will go all in if Rafah is invaded? A difficult question, Tony. I would say that the Hezbollah want to avoid a war with Israel. Not that Hezbollah couldn't significantly damage Israel, but they know that... Okay, well, if you look at what's happening in Gaza, which is every time the IDF actually meets resistance, they get their asses handed to them. The same would be true in a war between Hezbollah and Israel. Hezbollah would destroy Israel on the ground. But Israel, with full assistance from the United States, would turn Beirut into rubble, and all the other cities in Lebanon. They would make war on the Lebanese civilian population. Why? Well, they know they can't win a war on the ground, so they will try and destroy the support for Hezbollah as a political movement inside Lebanon by destroying an already battered and impoverished country that's been destroyed by imperialism and its comprador puppets. So that's why, part of the reason why Hezbollah has been reticent and holding back from doing anything more than they're doing at the moment. The Israelis don't really want to go into a war either, because it would be a war that on the ground they would lose. So at the moment you have this stalemate. Now, as to how this is going to end, I don't know. I think what we have to do is that we have to trust to a certain extent that Hezbollah and the other resistance forces do have a plan for this. We will see. I have some theories I'm working on about this, but until I've more thoroughly researched the propositions I'm investigating, I'm not prepared to go further than that at this stage. Red Star Betty says, People's Republic of Northumbria with strong links to Donbass and the liberated single people state of Palestine. See, the comrades in the northeast are already doing town twinning. J. Spartacus says, I'm not so sure the Buddhist monk that self-immolated in protest to the Vietnam War became an anti-war icon. His sacrifice achieved more than he could have achieved had he not done what he did. I don't agree with you, Jay. Yes, it's an iconic image, certainly, but that didn't cause the US to lose the Vietnam War. The US lost the Vietnam War because it was defeated militarily by the Vietnamese. Yes, it became a mobilizing symbol, but we will now never know what Aaron Bushnell could have achieved in life. And I don't think suicide is ever to be celebrated. I agree with Ash on this point. Beju says it's as if life under Nazi rule facilitated a socialist change. Well, nothing like being exposed to the full horrors of what the ruling class will do to make you become more of a revolutionary. Wayne says, thank you. These are obviously not my positions, but they are the most common critiques. How would you respond when people say people in the socialist East did not have freedom of movement? Well, I'd say that we don't. How do we have freedom of movement? In theory, we can go anywhere we want. In practice, you can only go anywhere you want if you have the money to do so. So all the freedoms that they say we have are freedoms which are entirely contingent upon your ability to actually pay for them. Secondly, people in the east of Europe could go anywhere they wanted inside the east of Europe, or also inside the Soviet Union, I believe. So, like, they could go on holiday anywhere inside the Eastern Bloc and anywhere inside the USSR. So the whole question of, well, why didn't they have freedom of movement? Well, they did. They had about as much freedom of movement in practical terms as the working class of Britain did, perhaps more. They were able to go to far more places. Now, what they're talking about is, of course, that they restricted the movement of skilled labor into the West, which was entirely right. Why should somebody who has been trained and educated in the socialist system just up sticks and fuck off, and they basically act as a scab so he can cash in the West on training given to him by his own country? You know, this freedom of movement thing is capitalist bollocks, basically. We don't have freedom of movement, you know. We don't have freedom to go anywhere we like, whenever we like. You know, our ability to do that is restricted by our incomes, and also the state, in our case, can withdraw your ability to travel. The state can cancel your travel documents. The state can do all kinds of things to you if they don't think you should be traveling. So this is the usual nonsense. What it is they say that the socialist states were failing because they didn't live up to bourgeois values. And the tragic thing is that the revisionist leaders in the East came to believe that as well. Unused sub. Having seen the recent Bald and Bankrupt video on the decline of Northeast England, what are the possibilities of a popular uprising in Britain? What are the maybe calls for a republic? Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, there's certainly enough people who are completely discontented with the system, unused sub. But as to whether that's going to lead anywhere at this stage, I don't know. I mean, there's again, I say there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of bitterness, there's a lot of disillusionment, but there's currently no way that gets expressed. Calls for a republic. It's not that people actually still believe in the fucking monarchy anymore, other than like right-wing dribblers, but it's just that nobody believes that a reorganization of the British Constitution is going to make it any better. So I think this tells us of the need to do a potential for a revolution in Britain episode. I'll make a note of it. I will come back to this. CJ says, I have heard the slogan, this is what you will be doing during the Holocaust, some of Bushnell's last words. It seems moralistic and essentially liberal. Yeah, well, CJ's right, and that's the US left for you. Unfortunate. I don't want to denigrate the man. Yeah, I mean, it's liberal because and moralistic because essentially that's what the US left is. That's unfortunate, but that's the reality. President Jesus says that Buddhist monk later had his death repurposed into a Rage Against the Machine album cover. Nothing but ignominy there. Yeah, Jesus fucking Christ. Of all the things to be remembered for, that shit. Lurtis says, I am not completely sure we are talking about suicide here since it was not motivated by hopelessness. Also worth remembering such cases as Bobby Sands. That's a good point. Motivated by hopelessness, I think in this case, my interpretation of it is that it was. I think that it was, he evidently had no hope that anything other than the most extreme, as he put it himself, most extreme form of protest would make any impact. It'll have an impact on some people. I'm concerned that the impact that it will have is not particularly positive. What the US anti-imperialist movement needs is an infusion of the proletariat into it. What you have at the moment is something which is run by petty bourgeois leftists, academics, etc., and those engaged in non-productive labor. And that's what produces the, same with us, the unholy mess, combined with, by the way, people who are hiding their social chauvinism behind communist imagery. cough cough CPUSA, who are still trying to find a good reason to both vote for Biden and declare themselves to be against the genocide in Gaza. So it seemed hopelessness then. It did come from a degree of hopelessness. Now, the case of Sands and the hunger strikers is an interesting one. There's I'd say that has to be considered slightly differently in a way, because with Sands, and not just with Sands, but the others, they were part of a much larger movement that consisted of a military side in the form of the direct struggle against the British occupation, the physical force republicanism, a political side in that they were, as Sands himself was elected to the British Parliament whilst starving himself to death in prison, and it was linked to and the fact that Sands came from the IRA, there were others from the IRSP, who were linked organically to a mass base within the Irish working class in the occupied 6 counties. So that I think needs to be treated slightly differently, in that they weren't dying just as individuals. They were men who were part of a much, much wider movement that had a great deal more power to it. And that I would make the argument that means it should be treated slightly differently. If you have a different opinion, I'm, of course, more than happy to discuss. Wayne says it's hard not to feel at least some sense of hopelessness when you consider what a revolution in the technologically advanced surveillance internet age would look like. I think this necessitates yet another discussion, Wayne, on not getting overawed by technology, which I think I would urge all comrades not to fall into that particular trap. But we'll come back to that, because I now need to get onto the subject of which I set up this live stream to talk about. But yeah, it's an interesting discussion as always in the chat. So the question now as to what I'm going to talk about here is the Islamic panic that the ruling class is engaged in here. Now, before we begin, I want to read something out to you from Marx that will illustrate that none of this is new. Right. This is a quote from Marx from 1870. This is from a letter he sent to Siegfried Meyer and August Vogt in New York. And the quote reads as follows. Every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into 2 hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening the domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the quote-unquote poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the United States. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret impotence of the English working class. Despite its organisation, it is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. So, nothing new in this, you may say. I read that out as a precursor to what I'm about to say. Now, what the British ruling class and their strategists, such as they are, have been doing since the explosion of the Palestine solidarity movement since October the 7th and the Israeli murder spree in Gaza, they have been trying for months now to find some way of discrediting the Palestine solidarity movement in the eyes of the wider working class. First of all, they called it a hate movement. Then they decided to again, they charged some of my own comrades with racism crimes initially for selling a pamphlet that made the correct comparison between Zionism and fascism. They then tried to say it was supporting terrorism, hence that the next charge that were thrown at my own comrades was that of supporting terrorism. And then they moved on from that, and this is where the gobshite Lee Anderson comes in, to saying that this is all part of an Islamic takeover of Britain. Now, the whole thing with regard to this needs to be considered in the context of at least 30 years of this kind of manipulation from the ruling class. They have, of course, worked relentlessly since the counter-revolutions of 1890 to 91 to make sure that class divisions never return to haunt them. And so to that end, they have been working to keep cultural, religious divisions as alive as they possibly can between the working class and the major cities in Britain. And this is the reason why, on the one hand, the ruling class will foster the development of fascist organizations, and on the other, they will, of course, foster the development of, in the case of Islam, Islamic fundamentalist organizations. Now, the question of why do they engage in this? Again, it comes back to what Marx was saying there. Fundamentally, this is about making sure that the division remains between the different aspects of the working class in Britain, the different layers of it. You have many different divisions, unfortunately, in the British working class. Now, as Marx was identifying there in that quote in the letter to Siegfried Meyer, he started to identify the beginnings of the labour aristocracy there. Part of the working class gets essentially bought off by capital, makes themselves into a tool for reaction. So, what the ruling class is very aware of that, and so as Britain has become more of a working class that is drawn from different areas, often of the old British Empire, the ruling class has, of course, recognized this and worked overtime to foster as many divisions between these newer working class communities and the older working class communities. Now, the Muslim takeover shit, which they've been going on about at the moment, this is something which has been kicking around for a while. I can remember this being a thing that, like, the fascists were going on about 20 years ago. And it particularly picked up speed in the late 2010s, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, with the emergence of something called the English Defence League, which was a rather shady outfit of fascists run by this knobhead whose actual name was Stephen Yaxley Lennon, but his stage name is Tommy Robinson. Now, he's this character who's been... He's a fairly obvious plant of the security services, to be frank. And as we've said before, all fascism ultimately emanates from the bourgeoisie themselves. So this Islamic takeover thing was like a meme that the fascists of about a decade ago, longer than that actually, 14 years ago, started putting around. And Robinson was prominent in putting this about, and it got picked up by ultra reactionaries inside the United States, and it from the United States came back again in the form of various different sort of meme edgelords on the sort of the alt-right in Britain, such as it was, promoting the idea that there was not only there was an Islamic takeover going on, but that there were no-go zones in British cities. Now, as always with this stuff, the bourgeoisie floats things with the fascists yesterday that the ruling class will use in their propaganda today. Now, my own party, CPGB-ML, pointed out correctly 20 years ago in an analysis of why official anti-fascism is so bankrupt, that a lot of the stuff that the fascists of that time, they were known back then as the British National Party, were doing in terms of their rhetoric around immigration was very close to what the Labour Party and the Tories actually said and what their policies actually did. Same with this, like the anti-Muslim shit that was indulged in by Blair and Brown and Cameron was all designed to justify, of course, the imperialist wars in predominantly, but not exclusively, Muslim nations, particularly after 9/11. And they lent into this all the way through the 2000s. So the idea being, it's referred to, of course, as Islamophobia. I would say that a more correct interpretation would be it's more to do with anti-Arab and anti-Pakistani, especially, and anti-Bangladeshi racism. And the figure of the Muslim that is conjured up by the ruling class propagandists here is meant to cover these people, the people who are the principal targets of imperialist military interventions. And the idea is, of course, the classic old idea, to dehumanize them, to dehumanize the people, as to other them, to make it look as if their death is meaningless or even something to be celebrated. Now, it also has the side benefit for the ruling class here, in that there's whether they are people who have Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or West Asian or North African descent, there's an awful lot of them here now. And so by whipping this up, you also create divisions within the working class. And that's what they've been doing in an intense form over 20 years. Now, this takes the form of course, the most out there elements, the fascists doing it. But you also have the so-called respectable press doing it. So you have the tabloids running like anti-Muslim stories every other day. I mean, it was every day about 20 years ago. And also you then at the so-called respectable broadsheet press, as it used to be referred to, like The Guardian, running long-winded essays about how multiculturalism needs to be defended, but these Muslims need to be brought to heel, etc., uncivilized, etc., things like, usual shit like that. So this is a sort of general line that the ruling class has taken, and it's been taken in various different forms. There's the fascist, the purely fascist wing, and then there's the more liberal chauvinist wing. But it's all of a piece. It all comes out of a ruling class which is ultimately designing this stuff in order to justify their imperialist adventures overseas. And they've brought it back now, having spent 20 years banging the drum for it. They've been distracted in recent years with other issues. They've brought it back now because it seems the most useful tool that they can grab to demonize the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And so they're now arguing, it's all run by Islamists. And this was the position taken by the comedic character known as Elizabeth Truss, who, if you believe it or not, used to be Prime Minister of this country. But then again, so did Boris Johnson. And she was over with Steve Bannon the other day over in the United States because she's pimping a book that she's written, which I may read for entertainment purposes, about how to save the West. Now, if you want me to review this book, do let me know, because I would actually be interested to do it. It looks ludicrous. But with reference to the upcoming Rochdale by-election, where, of course, Mr. Galloway is standing, Bannon referred to Galloway's party as an Islamist party, which is laughable. Those of you who watch this program regularly will know that I certainly have my critiques of Galloway, but to call him an Islamist is fundamentally just ridiculous. It's a slander, and for once I hope Galloway does sue Bannon and Truss. But the question as to, Truss is an idiot. She's just pumping out stuff that's been handed to her. But she's now saying things that Tommy Robinson and the EDL were saying 10 years ago. And you get Tory MPs now coming out with the same shit about, there's no-go zones in Birmingham. There's no-go zones where the Islamists have taken over. Now, I used to live in Birmingham. I lived there for 5 years, between 2002 and 2007. I also live in Manchester, which is another city they always say has got no-go zones in it. So I've lived in various different locations around both cities. I've walked around locations that are supposedly no-go zones where whites fear to tread. Nothing has ever happened to me. Now, you may answer that I'm a 6'6" man, so perhaps that's why nothing happened to me. Okay, fair enough. But I've seen all kinds of people walking around these areas. They used to say that Moss Side in Manchester, that you couldn't enter it, you'd be gunned down in an instant. I used to get the bus through there, before they gentrified it. There's a few rowdy bastards, but nothing severe. This kind of shit gets indulged in by the bourgeois politicians, partly because these people are hopeless, racist reactionaries with no brains in their heads, but also because they're trying to whip up as much fear as possible and as much division, particularly now, partially because they're using this Islamist talking point to try and poison people against the Palestine Solidarity Movement. I don't think it's working. They're also, bear in mind, the Tories in particular are getting desperate because they need an angle to work for the election. And so they're leaning into straight up fascist talking points from a decade ago, hoping to whip up enough of a vote for themselves to stave off what will likely be an electoral disaster for them. I wish, by the way, that Starmer wasn't going to benefit from this. I wish that there would be a hung parliament and a weak government, but that's where we are. So they've got a double motivation. Starmer is also going to do more and more reactionary garbage as we get closer and closer to the election. He's probably going to appear on stage dressed as Queen Boudica or something, and declare himself to be the historic defender of Britain. He's probably going to I don't know, wave a Union Jack whilst eating a bacon sandwich, smoking a roll-up and drinking a bottle of Newcastle Brown to prove that he's in touch with the working class or something like that. He's probably going to go around for a week dressed as Admiral Nelson or any other ludicrous thing that you could think of. Basically, the way that the ruling class have decided to engage with this election, and it makes sense from their point of view, is that they are pushing it relentlessly into what was previously called by even certain elements of the liberal press fascist and ultra right-wing territory. They're going to try and fight the whole election, and they're going to try and make sure that the entire framing of this in the bourgeois press for the next 6 months, no longer, 9 months, well, until whenever we get this pointless incident out of the way, is going to be just focused relentlessly on immigration and, of course, the Islamic takeover. Now, just, I mean, I know that most of you watching this stream will know that this is bullshit, but I will now give you some statistics to show how stupid this talking point is. So, the stats for England and Wales and Scotland are taken differently. So I'm reading now from a bulletin from the Office of National Statistics that I will put in the chat so you can see it. The biggest increase in faith or in England and Wales is actually an increase in those who have no faith. So less than half the population now describes themselves as Christian. So that's like 46.2% of those who describe themselves as Christian. It's an astonishingly small number that actually go to church. The second biggest group with reference to religion is those with no religion, either agnostics or atheists. So that's like 22.2 million people versus 27.5 million who describe themselves as Christian. Now, the number who are described as Muslim, they're the single biggest religious minority in Britain. That's true. It's 3.9 million people in England and Wales, that is. So 6.5% of the population of England and Wales, mainly based in major cities and big towns, because a lot of them came over here, particularly if they're from what's the areas now known as Pakistan and Bangladesh. They came here principally in the 50s, 60s, 70s. A lot of them around Greater Manchester came to work in the old textile industry. Of course, that's all gone now. But you've also got a significant increase in the Hindu population. So now, well, this is 2021 figures. So in England and Wales, you have 1 million people describing themselves as Hindus. That's, of course, a couple of million less than the Muslim population. But that's gone up as well. So London, of course, according to the Office of National Statistics, says over a quarter, and this is a direct quote, of all usual residents reporting their religion other than Christian. So the whole question of whether it's an Islamic takeover is basically, it's fun. It's, of course, a giant piece of bullshit. What is true is that Muslims, in Britain anyway, Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs are more consistently and strongly religious in terms of their observation of religious practices than even those, most of them describing themselves as Christians, those who describe themselves as Christians. Like I said, like it's less than a fifth of the population that actually goes to church. Whereas I've lived in places like Rusholme in Manchester in the past, and I lived in Whalley Range for a while. I lived in Lower Chorlton for a while. And if you are anywhere around a mosque, you can always see like Friday prayers is, it's out the door. Like same with big religious occasions at the Hindu temples, the Sikh gurdwaras. So you have the minority religions, the principal minority religions are more stringent in their religious observations than the Christian population is. That's certainly true. But a takeover, don't make me fucking laugh. For the sake of completion here, giving a complete picture, we'll also give the Scottish statistics, and I will also post those into the chat. So we'll look at this. So the minority religions in Scotland, well, first of all, there's a massive decrease in the number of people who identify with the official Christian church in Scotland. So that's down to 32.4%. So biggest number of people who are related in terms of religion in biggest single category, religious category in Scotland is those with no religion. It's 1.9 million. Church of Scotland, 1.7 million. Catholics, 841,000. Other denominations of Christianity, 291,000. Muslims in Scotland, 76,000. Hindus, 16,000. Buddhists, 12,000. Sikhs, 9,000. Jews, around about 6,000. And other religion, 15,000. So it's not a takeover of Britain by Muslims or any other religious minority. The biggest takeover is of atheists, agnostics, those of no faith. That's the biggest increase. So it's garbage. Of course, it's garbage. It's something that comes straight from the ruling class, with the very obvious motivation of causing as many problems as possible inside the working class. But let's now deal with some comments that we've getting from the chat. Paul Gassari says, certain elements of the SWP smeared Galloway as an Islamist. Yeah, after they'd fallen out with him. They were very happy to work with him until, of course, he pulled a fast one on them, and then they broke apart, and the SWP lost about, between a third and a half of their membership to Respect. So, again, the SWP are not exactly principled men. Wayne says, asking is Islam compatible with Western values is a highbrow way of burning a cross. And Wayne makes a good point. Western values, by the way, are now killing thousands of people every week in Gaza. Western values are a fucking joke, by the way, when they're talked about by bourgeois politicians. If you want to talk about saving the rational core of the Enlightenment, then only the proletariat can do that. The bourgeoisie don't get to talk about values. Their values are fairly obvious by now. Paul Gassari says, speaking from the Islamic Republic of Birmingham, I can confirm we're all having a very jolly time and the food is much better here than the provinces. I didn't realise that you'd become an emirate already. My God, I'll have to see if I can get back in there. President Jesus says, will you be doing a June 2 review? Couldn't be worse than Napoleon. Yes, I will be reviewing. I'm going to review both, and I'm tempted to do a mega review of both the Villeneuve versions and the Lynch version. The Lynch version I still love because it has a specific charm to it, even with all its problems. But the next review, in response to a request that came in from the chat the other day, will be RoboCop, and that will be done on Sunday of this week. Ash says, Rochdale grooming were horrible crimes against working class girls. Very true. The rights claiming groomers were protected because of woke makes no sense, as it happened during War on Terror. Does anyone buy it? No, I don't. Look, the reason why those guys, those perverts, were able to get away with doing what they did to those girls is the same reason that the similar collections of men get away with doing it all the way across England, Wales, Scotland. it's because like the girls who were targeted were from some of the poorest areas, from the poorest and most troubled families, where nobody gave a fuck about them. And that's why they were targeted. They were targeted by these dirtbags because the authorities don't care. Not because they were afraid of being seen as racist. That's fucking bullshit. That the cops come out with that. But the cops aren't, as Ash points out, cops weren't too concerned about locking up vast numbers of Muslims on inflated and anti-terror charges or anti-terrorist plot or terrorist plots that the various different elements in the security services had cooked up. So that's fucking nonsense. They just didn't care. That's the truth. They didn't care about those children, those teenage girls being targeted by these degenerates, because they were from the lowest end of the working class. And in Rochdale, it happened to be Pakistani guys doing it. I can name you a few other places where it used to happen, and it was all done by white guys. It used to happen in children's homes right around where I grew up in the High Peak in the north of Derbyshire. There's been rings of guys busted, I believe, in the southwest, predominantly white guys doing it. So it's a class issue. It's not a race issue. It's not a religion issue. The cops aren't afraid of going after Pakistani guys. They're really not. The woke thing was used as an excuse. It was an excuse because they just didn't give a shit. So, for instance, 10 years ago, it was revealed that I believe, I'll have to find the exact reference, but it was around about 16,000 children, i.e. those under the age of 16, were registered as officially missing in Greater Manchester. I mean, it was at least 16,000. Nobody knew where they were. The authorities had lost track of them completely. Could be dead, could be alive. Weren't in school, weren't registered anywhere else. I think I need to get the updated number, but that was a scandal that hit the Manchester Evening News 10 years ago, and nobody gave a fuck. And those children were lost in the system, or out of the system, or just lost track of. And since COVID as well, thousands have been lost track of because, again, the schools stopped tracking them when they sent loads of kids home, like parents who, for whatever reason, were unable to handle them, and loads of kids went missing, dropped off the radar. The authorities don't care or don't have enough resources to track them. Again, it all comes down to class. You know, no one's busting a gut in the authorities for these girls because of their class position. The police are not afraid of arresting non-white people in Britain or in any other imperialist country. And as for backwardness in and sort of perverted and degenerate behaviour in any community, well, as Red Star Betty says in her comment, it was actually people from the Pakistani areas that tried to stop what was going on. So, and again, people, often women in those areas, are very aware of the perverted weirdos who exist in those communities and try to do something about it. So, and the idea that the state actually wants to help any community get over backward attitudes or problems that keep reoccurring in that community, the state's not interested in doing that. They're interested in exploiting these problems, not solving them. And the fascists don't care either. Look, nobody on this who's watching this will believe the lies of Robinson and the EDL, but if you look at the background of the EDL leadership, look at how many of them were actually paedophiles, rapists, sexual degenerates of all kinds. The fascist groups always attract those kinds. Why? Because those guys are very easy to control. It's the same method, by the way, that the Northern Ireland Special Branch and MI5 used to control loyalist gangs in the occupied 6 counties. The same with the fascist groups here. All these groups are riddled with security service informants and direct agents, and the reason why so many people in the hierarchy of them have a litany of either violent crimes or sexual crimes or both in their rap sheet is because those are the kind of people who are attracted to this kind of shit, and also those people are very easy to control. So if you believe that an organization led by a bunch of perverted lunatics like the EDL cares about the fate of working class girls anywhere in Britain, well, then you're an absolute fucking fool, is all I've got to say about that. Slava says, if religion mattered in immigration questions, then the American right would be happy with Mexican and Latino immigrants coming. They're all Christians. Yeah, well, doesn't matter to them. There were also Pakistanis who tried to help victims of the groomers. In one book I read, by hiding a girl in an empty house he owned and bringing her shopping regularly. Yeah, and that's the sad thing. Like, it should never have come to that. But again, the system just does not give a shit about these girls at all. Richard Madden asks, why do the Liberal Democrats exist? Very good question. But then again, why does the Green Party exist? Why does the Labour Party still exist? Liberal Democrats exist to principally give Guardian readers something to vote for, and now give Remainer Tories something to vote for. Lord Mountbatten, pedo prince and protected by the state. Yep, and I've got an article coming out featuring that guy on the Class Consciousness Project later this week. So be sure to go to the site for that one. But yes, an example of why the ruling class lets these kind of like deviants get away with it is because many of them are up to the same thing. Jimmy Savile, protected by the system, yes indeed. Cyril Smith, well, yeah, Cyril Smith was the MP for Rochdale for a long time. He got away with his paedophile offences for a long time because essentially he knew too many things. He knew who else was involved in it in Parliament, and he would have been prepared to shoot his mouth off if he was ever stopped. And David Steele, the leader of the Liberals at the time that Smith was an MP, who recommended Smith for knighthood, admitted to an inquiry into this that he knew what Smith was up to and recommended him for a knighthood anyway. But then again, that's probably part of the qualifications you have to get a peerage. James Graham, who says, local Labour councillor just got convicted for child sex abuse. Well, what a surprise. Greetings to Fenrir. Red Star Betty says, you make a good point about the police not caring about lower class kids. I guess their excuse, racism is probably just bullshit. Yeah, it's complete bullshit. Look, the police are happy to have that promoted as the reason why they didn't do anything, but they've never done anything. They didn't. Think about it. Like going back to the Cyril Smith thing. Cyril Smith got away with it when before he was an MP. He was a councillor in Rochdale for many years, and he was done then. There were boys from children's homes complaining then that he was abusing them. And he turned up to the police station and basically says, I'm a very important man. You can't believe these little scumbags. They're from troubled homes. You've got to believe me that I'm a respectable man. They're making things up about me. And he's got the charges dismissed. And why did he get away with it? He got away with it because he was considered to be a man of importance. The boys that were complaining about him were kids from troubled homes. Kids from lower-end working-class estates, people the system doesn't care about, because that's who these degenerates always target. They don't target children from upper-class homes or upper petty bourgeois homes. They target the lowest end of the working class, who they know the system doesn't give a fuck about. And then you get fucking clowns like Tommy Robinson, who works with sex offenders and paedophiles, turning up and gesticulating around about it and pretending that he's a great crusader for children. Get fucked. Seriously, the whole thing's a state operation. EDL are terrible, still are, yeah, and funded by the ruling class, as even a BBC investigation revealed 10 years ago. Guy, good evening to you. Mob 2002 said, Alex, you talk about Scott Ritter's legal allegations in the USA. Well, I'm aware that he was arrested on a sex crime charge, and I'm aware that he has always insisted that he was stitched up by the authorities. Now, I think this was over 10 years ago now. I can well believe that he was stitched up by the authorities. They would certainly have good motivation to do it, and they've stitched up other people using the same process. Now, I haven't read enough about his case to comment on the specifics, but if people want me to talk about it, I will read more into it. I will take Jenny's suggestion of looking at the interview between him and Laurie Spencer. How would you describe the voting base for Labour today? Well, well, around here in South Manchester, you've got a residual Labour vote in the working class, but you've also got it's the upper working class around here that votes Labour. So you got in like the Withington area, you've got like upper end, what you'd call professionals, upper end working class, doctors, lawyers, NGO workers, people like that. They're the most loyal Labour voters these days. There's a residual working class vote for Labour that is basically just based on the fact that the three generations before them voted Labour. That's started to break down now, but its principal voting base is becoming has become more and more openly like the Labour aristocracy, basically. That's always been the core of its vote, to be honest. I mean, the lower end working class was enthusiastically voting Labour and joined Labour for the period Labour was actually doing something for them to a certain extent, between 45 and 51, or 45 to 58, 59, and after that it just tails away. As soon as Labour stopped performing for the bulk of the working class lost interest in them. Right. Any chance of communists forming an alliance with David Icke's movement, asks Beju, as a popular anti-imperialist front, or will they turn into arch enemies? Bluntly, and only speaking personally now, I would say no. Look, I've met quite a few of the people who get drawn into like the David Icke sort of orbit, and to be honest, the defining point of view, even beyond like the strange shit that Icke believes in, the point of view that a lot of them have is that it's very, very individualistic. A lot of them have a very sort of petty bourgeois mindset, and that's what lends them to believe in like there is a small clique manipulating things behind the scenes. So it's the same with the people who follow Alex Jones. People who follow David Icke start to believe that there's something is fundamentally wrong with the system, but then they come up with the wrong answer, which is that there's a small clique, be it lizards in man costumes or globalists directing it all from behind the scenes. Look, I mean, I would talk to people I've talked to a lot of people who believed in stuff like that on the anti-lockdown demonstrations 3 or 4 years ago now. And a lot of them like had solid instincts in that they were being lied to, that the system's working against them, that the authorities weren't to be trusted. All very solid instincts. They'd just gone in the wrong direction with them. So what I would say in answer to your question is, I've talked to anybody in the working class who's been drawn towards that stuff, and just try to point out where it's wrong. I wouldn't say that any communist should be getting into some sort of popular anti-imperialist front with people like Icke, who I am deeply suspicious of, and everybody should be. But talking to individual workers who've been drawn towards those points of view, yeah, I think that's something we should be doing, certainly. Paul Gassari says, extremely difficult to rouse people where I live, a very working class area, out of residual Labour voting because of lesser evilism. Yeah, I think that's getting less as time goes on. Maybe it's just the circles I move in, but I think there's less and less enthusiasm for it. I think 2019 was a bit of a break because Labour lost so many seats, mainly down to Brexit and a couple of other things as well. But the only reason that holds together is because, like you say, lesser evilism, and also sort of family traditions and that kind of thing. And the role of the trade unions is important as well, because even in their diminished state, they still are able to pull around 6 million members. There's 6 million members officially in the trade union movement. So it's still a big force. It's still a big weight in society, even though it's diminished. And as long as they remain solidly behind the Labour Party, it's still going to pull a lot of workers towards it. So we have problems to overcome there. CJ says all the leftists were up in arms about Ritter being scheduled for the Rage Against the War Machine rally for sex charges reasons. That only proves Ritter's point in my books that leftists are state assets. Well, the entire left is a state resource. So CJ's point is correct. Paul Gassari says sometimes Ikeism is the only or the first critique of power they encounter, so it seems like a revelation to them. Yes, that's true. A good point. Ash says many people have lost faith in institutions. I have a hard time believing that the state-based Islamophobia will win this time. People still remember the disastrous war on terror and how it led us here. Yeah, I don't think it's going to work, to answer Ash's point. This didn't really work 20 years ago. Yeah, it like they conjured the EDL and they conjured like some pretty. They got like 10,000, I think, at their peak, marching around the place. But when now it's been adopted by the Tories and it'll be adopted by the Labour Party as well, it's gonna be less and less believed. The problem isn't really. I mean, in the big cities where like you work alongside people from all kinds of backgrounds, like this doesn't stick at all, because in every workplace I've been in, be it in Birmingham or Manchester, or London for a little bit, you work alongside a lot of Muslims, especially in the public sector that I've worked in, and everybody in every office or job or some of the remaining manufacturing areas in the cities, like there'll be a few Muslims there, so everybody knows somebody. So it's hard to demonize people who work right next to you on the same terms and conditions as you. It was easier, to go back to the quote from Marx, to demonize the Irish 150 years ago, or even less time ago than that, because the Irish workers, when they first came here, worked for significantly less money, whereas like people my age and younger, you go into the workforce, you're working on the same terms and conditions as the Muslim guy or woman in the office or in the factory floor. So it's going to be a much more difficult thing for them to pull off. And now that the official politicians have adopted this narrative, it actually seems like a lot less of an outsider thing to have. So it'll have even less appeal. It'll convince some people, yeah. It mainly convinces lower end working class in the more isolated towns, not in the major cities. So it may create problems, but I don't think it's going to be as big a winner as they think it's going to be. It's certainly not going to damage in a major way the Palestine Solidarity movement. It's just the latest thing it's the latest lump of shit they're throwing out there, basically, to just try and confuse the issue, muddy the waters. C. Bolt says, I always felt that David Icke was a bit of an anti-Semite. I know that's bandied about a lot these days. The trope seems to overlap. Yeah, he is an anti-Semite. No two ways about it. The guy has some straight-up fascist beliefs. And that's why I think that you're talking to people who believe in that, yeah, that's fine. But working with that guy, absolutely not. Red Star Betty says, I'd be very surprised if Ritter's conviction wasn't a state operation. Yeah, I think it probably is. Just judging by the pain in the arse that he'd been for the state beforehand. Again, no, I will research more into it before pronouncing. Red Star Betty says, I've met Ike followers too, and like MAGA followers, identify issues but come to wrong conclusions. Very true. This may seem like a silly question, says Mob 2002, but what is the Marxist perspective on political realism, like the likes of John Mearsheimer? I'd say for Mearsheimer, I mean, the realist school. Well, you know what? If I get into that, I'm going to be here a long time. So, Mob 2002, I'm going to ask you to email me the question at the usual address. And what I will do is I will respond to it on a specific program in the near future. Because to deal with the sort of foreign policy realist school, that's going to take quite some time. So I will come back to it. Lucas says, people don't believe in institutions but have no alternative to engage in and strive towards. Yes, that's true. Okay, so hitting midnight here in the land of perfidious Albion. So I'm going to draw the stream to a close now. You can, of course, find this on the Patreon site from tomorrow. And I'll be back again tomorrow evening at the same time with... I think it's probably going to be the live stream covering the latest from the front lines in Ukraine, given how that's going at the moment. So, thank you to everybody who's joined this evening. Be back with you again tomorrow.